Hey, this is Frank. In this video I make quite a few mistakes and I try a lot of things that I've never done before. But like they say, all is well that ends well.
Frank does it.
I had a client reach out to me wanting me to build them a 34-inch Lazy Susan, which that presented quite the problem for me because I didn't currently have anything to cut that big of a circle. So keep watching and you'll see what I came up with. White oak is a good choice because it's inexpensive, but it's also a hardwood, and it just looks really nice when you get some finish on it. When clamping these up, I'm using these woodpecker bridge cauls. They're pretty good at holding the two pieces together, but they're not going to hold your whole panel flat. But you can see right here I've got a little bit too much pressure and the panel is bowing. This is okay for now because I wanted to make sure I got full closure on these joints. Once I get the clamps put on the top, I can adjust the pressure of all the clamps to ensure that I have a perfectly flat glue up. It's best if you check your panel at each clamp with the straight edge. Like I said, I glued up two of these panels, and this footage is a mix of both of them. I didn't want to bore you with all the footage since they're essentially the exact same steps for both. These Felthouse clamp saddles that I'm using here are so handy to keep your workpiece off the bench, and they slide nicely into my micro jig dovetail tracks. He makes these for T-Track, but I just retrofit them to accept the micro jig hardware. By the time you're watching this, he has developed a much nicer 3D printed version. These will accept both parallel clamps and pipe clamps. Ryan is a fellow woodworker and a friend of mine. He has done an excellent job on these, and I'll link them in the description. This is not an ad, I'm just trying to help a brother out. So let's make it hard for him to keep these in stock. Now I'm just going over these panels with a flattening sled that I purchased from Clear Cut Woodworking. This thing's been a lifesaver. It makes flattening really easy, especially for pieces that are wider than my 6-inch joiner. For this application, I'm only going to be flattening one side of the panel. The reason I'm only doing one side is that I want to keep this Lazy Susan as thick as I can. If I flatten both sides all the way to the corners, there's a good chance that the corners are lower than the center, and since I'll be cutting the corners off, it makes sense to flatten the other side after I cut the circles. When securing these panels down to the table, I'm using blue painter's tape and hot glue. I've tried using double-sided tape before and ended up breaking one of the grids off my assembly table.
Don't let anybody ruin your day. Ruin it yourself. Be a man.
That screw up was actually an easy fix. I just glued it back in place. But that's why I do it with blue painter's tape and hot glue from now on. So here's my solution to not having something to cut big enough circles. I made this circle cutting jig on my router table. It consists of a piece of plywood and a runner that goes into the miter slot. Between the lip in the front and the miter bar, it keeps this thing from moving around. If you want to see how I built this jig, I'll leave a link at the end of the video, and I'll leave one in the description to a video of me teaching you how to make it.
See how pretty I make a circle? That's why I'm making this jig.
This style of jig is not any kind of new concept, but I haven't seen anyone make one this big to cut such big circles with the router table.
Well, that sucks. My camera decided it was gonna overheat, and so I'm gonna cut the big circle and make sure I get that all on camera.
You can cut big circles on the bandsaw, and I thought about making a jig for the bandsaw, but having the jig on this big tabletop just created so much more support for the workpiece. Cutting this rough cut circle out is kind of unnecessary, but I didn't want these big pieces of wood on the corner of the panels hanging off the edge, and it was a little bit easier to see what I was doing by making a rough cut circle ahead of time. It's very important to cut this in incremental cuts because if you try to go all the way through the wood, you're going to have issues. Things could get violent. So I just take quite a few passes with the spiral upcut bit. I've seen people who will make one pass on the bottom of the circles and then trim it with the bandsaw or jigsaw and then use a flush trim bit to finish the circle. This is what I would recommend if you were using a straight cut bit or a bit that isn't designed to make a plunge type cut. By using a spiral upcut bit, I found that if you just take your time and use multiple passes, you can cut the whole finished circle and not have to worry about changing bits or using any additional tools. That being said, if you're worried about blowout when you plunge through your last pass, which I didn't have any issues with, by all means use the process I just mentioned. Another thing that you might be wondering is when you do these incremental climb cuts, when you raise that bit up, do you end up getting ridge marks in your workpiece? And you can see when I move this piece of wood right here, no ridge marks whatsoever. It just worked out really good.
34 exactly.
So you can see here I'm using the flattening sled again. Since the bottom of the circle and my bench are perfectly flat and my router sled is mounted perfectly level, this should make the thickness perfect throughout the circle. Now I'm just giving these a few passes through the drum sander to cut down on my hand sanding and knock off any ridges left by the surfacing bit. My drum sander is wide enough with the open end to be able to run the workpiece through, flip it around, run it through on the other side. I just do this a few times until I get a smooth surface. One of the problems with working with white oak is that it's kind of porous. So once you start milling it and stuff, you end up exposing a lot of these open pores. So I'm just using some Starbond CA glue to fill these voids. And then I use a heat gun to kind of get rid of some of the bubbles because I had to pour this stuff in pretty deep. And then I'll just hit it with the accelerator and it dries everything up real nice. And then take it back over to the drum sander to get rid of that glue. If you've made it this far into the video and you're enjoying it, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It means a great deal to my channel, and if you've already subscribed and you want to support the channel, you'd be surprised at how much sharing this video has an impact. Using my palm router, I wanted to throw a little round over on both sides of both the base and the top, just to make it nice to the touch and easy on the eyes. Now I'm using this little compass to figure out where the screw holes are going to be. Remove the plate and draw a nice thick line with the pencil. Then I'll lay this hardware back down and I'll go ahead and pre-drill the holes. That way after I finish it, I'll know exactly how to put this thing back on. And just like any other time, you don't want to drill all the way through your workpiece. That will ruin your piece and your day. So I went ahead and put some blue painter's tape on to mark the depth in which I wanted to drill these holes for the screws. Here I'm using a Forstner bit that's the perfect size to match these holes in the Lazy Susan hardware. This is the base, so I'm actually going to have to drill all the way through in order to have access to attach the base to the top when it's all said and done. And right here you'll see me make a rookie move. I had some of my old t-shirts laying on the bench and I tried to protect the wood from scratches, so I threw my old t-shirts down and I caught them with my Forstner bit.
Idiot!
Now I'm using the same method with the compass to try to figure out where the Lazy Susan hardware is actually going to mate to the top. And so I want to do it to where the two big holes are, and that's actually going to end up being 4 screws, but I have to make sure that I line up the screws with those big holes because that's what's going to line up with the base. And those holes that I bored through the base is how I'm actually going to be able to see where I'm putting the screws in. So now I'm just doing a final sanding on the top and the bottom, and then I'll go ahead and throw some Rubio Monocoat on both sides of the base and on the underbelly of the top, since I won't be able to finish those parts once I mate them together. Right here I'm just using some mineral spirits to clean up all the dust off the workpiece. I'm using the pure version of the Oil Plus 2C, and in order to do this properly you have to do like a 3-to-1 mix of the two parts, and that's what I'm doing right now. Rubio Monocoat is super easy to apply. You just wipe it on, scrub it in with a Scotch-Brite pad, and then wipe it all off until it's dry. I went and bought this super inexpensive Ryobi buffer just for this project to be able to buff this to a shine, and I'll go ahead and repeat the process with the bottom. You never want to leave a portion of your project unfinished, even if you can't see that portion, because you're allowing for a different moisture level to come through the part that you didn't finish, which will actually warp your piece in the future. And I'll just throw another one of my old t-shirts down just to protect each surface from scratching each other. I'm using this dry graphite lube that you would use for like derby cars or anything like that. I just really want to lube up this hardware and just make sure that it's going to be super smooth for years to come before I install it. This Lazy Susan hardware is 12 inches in diameter and it's good for 1,000 pounds. I'll go ahead and link it and basically all the tools that I use in this video down in the description if you want to check them out. And you can see right there I'm looking through those little holes that I bored to figure out where on the top to install it. So this was handy. So I do 2 screws here. I don't show the other 2, but the way I did it was you just rotate the base until you find the other 2 holes on the top. So there's actually a total of 4 screws, so this thing's super strong and super secure, and it's a really sturdy base. So again, I'm just using some mineral spirits to just make sure that I clean up all the dust out of those pores of the white oak before I throw my finish on there. And I saved this part for last just because I knew that it would be kind of handy to throw the finish on while I could spin the Lazy Susan, and it looks pretty cool doing it this way too. This little Ryobi buffer was well worth the money that I spent on it. It's not the nicest tool, but it did the job. I'm going to make a nice little shine on there, and this thing turned out really nice, and all in all the client was super happy with it. Let me know you made it to the end of the video by starting your comment with white oak. This is Frank, hoping your fasteners always stay tight. Thanks for stopping by. God bless you.